Welcome to our first flipped classroom video for AP Psychology at Granby High School. Our first unit is research methods, and our first video is going to talk about a specific type of research method that we're going to look at throughout the year, and these are descriptive research methods. Descriptive research does exactly what the phrase sounds like. It attempts to describe behavior. There are other types of research methods that are out there. There are those that attempt to explain behavior. We'll get into that in a different video. There are those that attempt to predict behavior, and we'll get into that in another video. But today we're going to focus on these three research methods that we need to know that at their core are attempting to describe what is going on, what the researcher is observing, what behaviors they're observing, whatever it might be. And so in that way, we're looking at descriptive research methods today. The first descriptive research method that you need to know is something called a case study. A case study is when researchers are looking at one individual or maybe a small group of people in depth. And yet when we're talking about taking a look at one individual in depth, usually over many sessions, and really getting a lot of information from them, you need to ask yourself, what type of individual would researchers really be interested in studying in depth? Or another way of looking at it is, why is it highly unlikely that anyone would ever want to do a case study on, say, me, for example? And what it comes down to is, case studies are usually done on very unique individuals, and can be unique for a variety of different reasons. They could be unique because they have some sort of really special ability or talent. They could be unique because they grew up in a very interesting, different social environment. They could be unique because they have some sort of brain abnormality. But whatever the case is, they're usually taking a look at individuals that are unique in some way. And in doing so, they're hoping to gather information that can maybe lead to research down the road that would help to explain or describe behaviors in humans, at large. So one of the advantages of case studies is that it can provide you with lots of information about this one individual. And it can allow you to study topics that are really not suitable for experimentation. If you take a look at the pictures on the screen, there is a picture of Henry Molaison, one in his youth, obviously, and one as he was older. Henry was someone who, through a surgery gone wrong, lost most of a brain region called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a brain region that we now know is responsible for helping us to form new memories. When the surgery was done in the 1950s, the understanding of the hippocampus was just not there. And so when Henry came out of this surgery, what the researchers realized is, yes, his personality was normal. He was able to interact with people on a normal basis, but he wasn't able to form any new long-term memories. His memory span would last for as long as he could pay attention. So if he was talking to you, he could hold a general conversation. If he was distracted by someone else and turned away and then came back to you, he would often introduce himself and would act as if he had never spoken to you before. And so he had what we call anterograde amnesia, this inability to form new memories. Well, obviously this provides a unique opportunity to study someone who has lost this brain region, the hippocampus, and clearly has some cognitive deficits. And to kind of map out exactly what his cognitive deficits are, and in that way, trying to describe what happens to an individual who is missing a large portion of his hippocampus. You can't obviously run an experiment that would mimic these same conditions. You can't go around lopping people's hippocampi out and seeing what happens. So this allows researchers to take a look at something that just couldn't be done in experiments. Now, one question to ask, or another question to ask is, so after decades of studying Henry's brain, after decades of mapping out exactly what cognitive deficits he had, once we have all of that information, what can we say about the hippocampus and the role that it plays in memory? Well, since we are taking a look at this one individual, from this study, or from these decades of studies on Henry, all we can really say in the end is that this loss of brain tissue caused these specific cognitive deficits in Henry and in Henry alone. Because you cannot generalize from a case study of one individual to a larger population. What it does for the researcher, an advantage then, is that it does suggest areas for future research. So now we suspect the hippocampus may have something to do with memory. So now we can do other research to kind of flesh that out. And over the years, we've certainly done that, and it's pretty well established the role that the hippocampus plays in helping to form new long-term memories. But you do need to remember that case studies, you cannot generalize from them, because in the end, that may have just been something that was unique to Henry. And that way, the results can't be misleading. If you are quick to jump from one case study to deciding that therefore applies to a larger human population. All right, so case studies studying one person or a group of people in depth. A second type of descriptive research is the survey. Now, we're all familiar with surveys. Surveys can be done over the phone. They can be done on paper. Many are done online now. And these are, of course, attempts to gather self-reported attitudes by individuals. Lots of advantages. They're quick. They're easy. They're cheap. You can get this done with little to no money. But you have to be careful that you're doing this survey right if you are attempting to use that data and claim that it describes a larger population's beliefs or attitudes or behaviors. So one of the things that you need to be concerned with is exactly how did you choose your sample for your survey. If you were doing a survey and wanted to do a survey of Granby High School students and wanted to see how they felt about, say, a new cell phone policy, one tactic that you could use to find students to participate in your survey is you could simply stand at the front door and interview anyone who is willing to come over and be interviewed by you. You could do that, but it wouldn't produce results that were very representative of the students at Granby High School as a whole. And here's why. People come into Granby from all sorts of entrances. There's the back entrance, there's the bus ramp, there's the parking lot by the gym. And so by simply standing at the front door, you are leaving out or excluding all other students. They come to school in different ways. Secondly, simply interviewing those who are willing, who wanted to come over and be interviewed, that produces a bias in your sample, and that you're really just looking at people who are kind of interested in participating in these things kind of inherently. And so you have to be careful about how you pick your sample. If you want to be representative of a population as a whole, you would want to get a more random sample of Granby High School students, or create some sort of mechanism in which all students had an equal opportunity for being selected for that survey. When doing surveys, you have to be careful about sensitive topics and understand that oftentimes when surveys are done about sensitive topics, the results might be skewed. If you're doing research on race relations, for example, understand that this topic makes people uncomfortable, that many people don't want to admit to their own racial biases, and so therefore their answers may be skewed from what is reality because again, they don't want to admit that they harbor those feelings. And then finally, with surveys, you need to be careful about how you word them. The wording of a survey can make a profound difference in what the results are. I have a background in teaching AP government, and one of the things we talk about in our social policy unit is that when you survey Americans and ask them how do they feel about welfare programs, or do they feel the government should expand welfare programs, the overwhelming majority of Americans say no, they do not feel that welfare programs should be expanded. In a different survey, if you were to ask Americans, do you believe the government should expand programs to help those in need, then the overwhelming majority typically answer yes, they do support those types of programs. Well, the problem is that those two surveys are essentially asking the same thing. It's just that one of them has a word that has become in our society a loaded word through decades of politicians using it in campaigns, welfare has become a very negative word in our society, and people react negatively to that in surveys. So in this case, you have to be careful about exactly how you worded your survey in order to get accurate information. So again, surveys. You're tempted to describe how people are reporting that they're feeling, or reporting what types of behaviors they're involved with, or whatever it might be. The final type of descriptive study that we're going to take a look at are naturalistic observations, which again sound exactly how, or do exactly what they sound like they do. You are observing someone or something in its natural habitat. You want to see how they're acting in the real world. And so in that way, it's a type of study that has what we call high ecological validity. What we mean by high ecological validity is that this research is very good at showing how people are acting in the real world as compared to how they act in a controlled kind of experimental environment. When conducting a naturalistic observation, obviously you are giving up control of the situation. And that lack of control has positives and negatives. One positive is that it gives you this high ecological validity. But a negative is that sometimes you'll do a naturalistic observation looking for a specific behavior, and it just never really materializes during that observation. So let's imagine that you wanted to do research on how young children resolve conflicts. And so you decide to go down to the local playground, and you're going to sit back and observe and look for specific behaviors that children have when resolving conflict. But unfortunately for you, you just happen to come on the happiest day ever. And all of these children are just happily running around and playing. And there's just no conflict happening that day amongst any of the children playing on the playground. You can't interject. You can't step in and try to artificially create a conflict. So you just have to kind of sit back and hope that it comes about. And if it doesn't, then it's just a lost day for you. So that can be a disadvantage, certainly, or a way that lack of control can be a disadvantage. Another, like most descriptive studies, you can't generalize from naturalistic observations. You can't then say that if you're doing that naturalistic observation I was just talking about, you can't then say that this is how all children resolve conflict on all playgrounds. You can only talk about the population that you were specifically observing. And then finally, you need to be concerned or aware of the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is the idea that observation inherently changes behavior. And so if you're going to study conflict resolution on the playground, once children notice that they're being observed, that may in fact change their behavior. And so you need to try to take measures to limit that effect. And that can be difficult because most times research requires, or ethical guidelines require, that you get consent in order to perform research. Well, if you're getting consent, then the people that you're observing are going to know that they're being observed, and that may in fact bring the Hawthorne effect into play. So it can be difficult at times, but there are ways to kind of minimize that effect that we'll talk about later in the year. All right, so in sum, we've talked about 3 descriptive research methods: case studies, surveys, naturalistic observations. We call them descriptive research methods because they don't attempt to explain the behavior. They don't attempt to predict behavior in the future. They are simply describing the researcher's observations about what's going on with that population at that time. So that concludes our first video on descriptive research methods. Our next video, we'll take a look at a predictive research method called correlation studies. Until then, good night.